We've got a lot of goodies on this program, as you know, and our formal AA meeting for Sunday has already started, but we will now hear again from the founder of our great organization, Bill Wilson.
Good morning, dear people.
Good morning.
In the middle of the 19th century, a new means of communication burst upon the world to set in motion a train of events of consequences that even now cannot be reckoned. This was the telegraph. It is a matter of great significance and meaning, at least to us, that the first words set over the first wire between Washington and Baltimore were these. And they apparently characterized the inventor. The words were, "What hath God wrought?" So today, over a retrospect of 30 years, we are watching the building of a new means of communication characterized not by material things, but a new way of speaking the language of the heart, one to another. And this language is a varied language, and we have participated in one of its magnificent variations in this meeting, having in it these components of science and of the spirit, the only synthesis of any great promise to the world of our time. To have been part of this, I wish to renew the thanks of Lois and myself. Indeed, may I speak for all of you. And thanks to each of you and to God for these precious hours now drawing to a close. I would like to direct our special gratitude to Don and to Luke and to their co-workers whose selfless efforts have made this occasion possible. I think to a woman and to a man, we are remembering that Don made his demonstration in the face of adversity, the adversity of precarious health, a source of information or inspiration that will be with us always. Polly's talk recalled other days. The spirit of dedication and of love that characterized that couple will live in this society, within the society forever, and its waves will lap on ever more distant shores. as we heard this last magnificent talk, I began to think of the embryo. That was the beginning of AA. That preceded the birth into the new life. And each of us in this far-flung society, we're in that embryo. But it was a very unpromising womb. For until recent times, the only result could have been a stillbirth into deformity, lunacy, or stillborn into the grave. And in that we were. And for most of us, it was a very dark place, only illumined by the few who chose to stay with us until the end should come. Lois was my companion. And we searched for years to find the entrance through which we might merge into better things. And we had not found the grace to make that discovery. And then it seemed to us, or it seems to us now, that Providence was preparing a table, the one at which we have since so joyously feasted. And one by one, those who were to participate in the creation of this benign synthesis began to place candles upon that table. And though we knew it not, this was the beginning of a new means of communication, each with the other. The language of the heart as spoken in AA. In a sense, I suppose our beginnings are infinite ages old, because there has never been any age in which the impulse to reach for a higher power was absent, since man became conscious. Then came the carpenter. And of course, we are in his tradition and teaching. But I would like to pinpoint, in terms of people, who the personal candle bearers were in the beginning. And I am happy to say, especially so, since we have heard so much good-natured, and perhaps not so good-natured, derogation of psychiatrists, that this man happened to be a psychiatrist. And in the view of many, I'm one of the great figures of our generation. I speak of Carl Jung, one of the three founders of the modern art of depth psychology. He was distinguished from the other founders in that he felt, and I am sure knew in his inner heart that man was something more than a modicum of intelligence often ill-used. He was something more than a bundle of instincts, something more than $2 worth of chemicals. I'm sure of this because I know people who have been in contact with him. And one of my chief regrets is that a correspondence that we had begun before his death had not been started years earlier. So Vision, if you will, a prominent American businessman who I shall call Roland. Roland was the typical case. He had exhausted every resource that he knew. So he came to Carl Jung, and they spent a year together. And Roland became convinced that now so many of the hidden springs of his strange compulsions and motivations stood revealed that he would drink no more. Leaving the doctor, he was drunk within a month. To him, this was a ghastly experience. This was the end. And he came back to Dr. Carl and said, Carl, you were my court of last resort. Is there anything else? And this very kind old gentleman said, Roland, I thought that you might have been one of those rare cases in which my art might help you to sobriety and better things. But now I know your case is that of such gravity and complication that my art will not unravel it. And the patient took another dive toward deflation at depths, the basis on which our whole recovery rests. He hit bottom. But he persisted, Doctor, is there no other recourse for me? And the dear old gentleman said, Roland, yes, there may be, but I must be frank with you. It doesn't happen too often. I speak to you of a conversion experience. Oh, but I said, Roland, I used to be a vestryman in the church. My faith has still not left me. But this hasn't worked. Jung said, I am talking about something that goes beyond faith. I am talking about a transforming experience in which the recipient, as a gift, appears to undergo a motivation change that cannot be accounted for by simple faith, by environment, by motivation, by association. These profound changes seem to transcend the sum of all of the ordinary resources that can be brought to bear. Now, he said, among alcoholics, as among other men of all time, these profoundly transforming experiences have occurred here and there. We cannot tell to whom or when the lightning of providence will flash. So I suggest that you immerse yourself in a religious atmosphere, remembering your personal helplessness, and pray for God's will. So that is a word picture of the colloquy that took place between these two men about 1932. And this great and humble man had placed the first candle, which was to illumine the table at which we sup. Roland associated himself with the Oxford groups then in Europe, and practiced their principles, none of which was new. They had an emphasis. There was the idea of one person talking to the next. You know the rest of it. Our basics were abstracted from it. And unaccountably, Roland seemed to be released. He hadn't been educated out of drinking. He had been released from it. Then he came to America, where he fell under the spell of Dr. Sam Shoemaker, one of the founders of the Oxford group of that old time. And Sam was then also rector at an Episcopal church that stood at 23rd Street, New York. And in the Oxford groups, there were a handful of drunks who had been released. Most of them rather temporarily, but genuine release, nevertheless, by this sort of practice and attitude. And Roland bethought himself of an old school friend of mine. This school friend is the one so affectionately known to us as Ebby. Now I'll pause here, having illustrated to you this stream of influence, beginning with Jung, to the O.J., to Hazard. Now let's come down on the other tack and see what happened at the confluence. I'd gone the route. The story's old to you. You've read it. I've told you 1,000 times the story of my drinking. So I shall quickly bring myself to that day in 1934, midsummer, when another physician was speaking. Dear old Dr. Silkworth, who certainly will be known in our annals as a medical saint for so long as age shall last. Someone once wrote a grapevine piece about him, and the title was this: The Little Doctor Who Loved Drunk. And from the point of view of the rationalist and the scientific man, the little doctor was a nobody, even crank with odd ideas. He said that sure, there is a lunatic compulsion to drink. Certainly true enough. No doubt it may have psychological causes, trauma in youth, etc. But he said, I think that there is a big moral question here. And he also said, I believe that there is something wrong with the body and the metabolism of alcoholics. For short, not knowing what it is, I use a widely understood term called allergy. So this adds up to a compulsion that condemns the victim to drink against his will and interest until the destruction is complete. And this is joined to a physical condition that ensures his lunacy and finally his demise. On this hot summer night, this dear little man, who up to then had worked in drying out joints, Finally Towns Hospital, where I used to go, with perhaps 25,000 drunks, occasional successes here and there. He worked on a pittance. He boarded in the place. He had a room upstairs. So, as gently as he could, he told us what the score was. Just like Jung, speaking to Roland, he said, when Bill came here, he clearly wanted so desperately to stop that I thought he might be one of the few. But I'm afraid that I must say that he isn't. He's beginning to be deteriorated. I'm afraid if he would remain sane or even live long, that he will have to be committed. So this is the sentence. That science, in the persons of Dr. Jung and of Dr. Silkworth, passed upon me and upon all of us. And both these truly great men, great human beings, had had the courage to say what they believed. Well, meanwhile, my friend Abby had got into such a state that he was about to be committed for lunacy at a state institution in Vermont where the family had sunk. Town fathers had wearied of Abby. His last exploit had consisted of his just borrowing the old man's brand new Cadillac, running it down a main street a little ways off in the country at a very high speed, and quite without thinking, he veered off the road across a narrow field and into the side of a farmhouse. And this was the kitchen L or end of the house. It was not built very strongly, so the car went right into the kitchen with Abby still sitting there. And this kind of jolted him awake. A cowering woman sat in the corner, and of course Abby saw even through his haze that it was an awkward moment. And so he leaned out and he said, Well, he says, what about a cup of coffee? For the town fathers, this was it. So they gathered up Abbey, hailed him before the judge down at Bennington, and just as he was about to be rooted to the hoosgow at Brattleboro, then appeared Hazard, along with a couple of other drunks from the Oxford group. And they took Abbey into tow, and they got him sort of indoctrinated on the desirability of honesty, restitution, helping other people, prayer, and so forth. They brought him down to New York. Well, just after leaving the hospital, I had stayed sober for a month or two, out of sheer fear, constant vigilance. And then I was in the toils again. So about the time Abbey landed in New York and was parked because he was penniless in Calvary Mission, I'm sitting at the kitchen table. Lois is working in that department store. I had a communication, a kind of a language of the heart with the delicatessen up there, which supplied me with gin on credit. And I sat drinking and the telephone rang. And now I knew that this was it. Something told me so, and science had driven in the last spike. I was nailed down to stay. So the telephone rang, and here's Abbey. I thought he had gone to the booby hatch. I said, come on over. We'll talk about the good old days. Ah, what a very significant line. The good old days. Today was unbearable, and there would be no future. So we would talk. He appeared in the doorway. At once I sensed something indefinably different about him. He came in. He sat at this kitchen table in the basement. On it I had a big pitcher full of gin with a little pineapple juice sliced in so as to suggest cocktails instead of the straight stuff when Lois got home from the store. So I set out the tumbler for him and started to pour. He said, no thanks. What? No thanks. Well, what's got into you, Abbey? Not drinking? Well, he says, I'm not drinking today. Well, now, I said, come, let's have it. What's happened? Well, he looked at me and he said, I've got religion. Well, if I'd been deflated by the scientists, this really let me down to the middle of the earth. And because I had had a wonderful scientific education, too. Just like our last speaker, I knew better. Well, one must be polite, so I said to Abbey, what brand is it? And he said, I wouldn't exactly call it a brand. And then, being very careful to avoid the aggressive evangelism of the Oxford groups, he merely told me his story, how he'd met Hazard, come to New York, and had felt unaccountably released from this desire to drink. Well, this release was a new one. I was talking about the water wagon. So, his story carried great conviction to me. Over this identification, no doubt at great depth, over which simple ideas could be pitched in, instead of having to use the corkscrew of the psychiatrist from the top, he was able to go right straight through. He hadn't presented me with a single new idea at all. But I will say that after that conversation, I could never be the same man again. And so, without pressuring me at all, he took his leave, said, "I'll see you later." In no waking hour in the days that followed could the vision of Abby speaking across that table leave me. And, of course, I felt trapped. I said, but if I only could go along with this. Honesty, yes, you could make a try. Helping other people, dandy. You know, I'm public-spirited, etc. But the God bit. Oh. And this had really, although he had played it down, appeared to be the crux of it. So finally, one morning after Lois had gone and I'd got partly tanked up, I said, I've got to get a clear look at this thing. So I arrived up at Towns Hospital, half-stewed. Dr. Silkworth looked at me sadly, and I brandished the bottle and yelled, "Doc, this time I got something." And the old man said, "I'm afraid you have. You better get upstairs and go to bed." I wasn't in too bad shape. Sedative and that sort of thing was out of me. 2 or 3 days. I was a month or two early. And then, suddenly one morning about 11 o'clock, Abby stood in the door. Well, I was glad to see him, but I suspected that this was the time he turned up the heat on the evangelism. Well, now it is said by theologians that prudence is one of the greatest virtues, and Abby had it, and he knew my cast of mind. So he quietly sat down, and we began to talk about the folks up home, and this, that, and the other thing, until he obliged me to ask him, what's this little bunch of cliches now? Let's see how it was. You admit you can't run your own life. You get honest with yourself, about yourself. You talk it out with somebody, sort of a confession. Yeah. You make restitution for harms done. And then you pray to whatever God there is. Yeah, Abby says, that's about it. Now, what do you think it's going to rain tomorrow? He kept making at him. And finally, without exerting 1 ounce of pressure on me, got up and went out of there. And I thought to myself, well, gee, this fellow really practices what he preaches. He had already bound me to him in the cords of a new understanding and love. Spoken to me at depths in the language of the heart. We all know what happened. Thus I was prepared for the great event of my life. And so, after he is gone, of course, I commenced my old struggle with the God bit. And I finally thought, well, was it the egg that came first or the hen? And I could not decide. And this let me down into a depression, and I've had some dandies since, for which there was no description at all. I mean, the sheer hysterical agony of this thing is beyond words. And finally, and momentarily, I suppose, indeed I know, the last vestige of this prideful obstinacy were rubbed out. So, as a small child, frightened by the dark, in this strange womb in which I had found myself, I cried out, if there is a God, will he show himself? Instantly, the place seemed to light up in a blinding glare. I was instantly transported into an ecstasy beyond description. I began to have visions of the mind's eye sort. It seemed to me that I was on a mountain. A great wind was blowing, and it came around me, and then it passed through me. And I thought to myself, this is not of air. This is of spirit. This is the God of the preacher. And then the ecstasy subsided a great deal. I found myself lying on that bed. But now I am in a new dimension. Just as our late friend put it, I was a part of the universe at last. In however small way I did belong. And I reveled in this. And then at length, science came back and said, my God, you're hallucinating. So then comes the little doctor who loves drunks. I had summoned him. I said, Doc, as well as I can recount it, here it is. This is what has seemed to happen, what I know has happened, and yet I am frightened. Am I hallucinating? He questioned me very carefully and very gently. And he finally said great words for Alcoholics Anonymous. Said that obscure little doctor with no professional reputation, Bill, some great psychic event has occurred. I don't pretend to understand it. I have read about these things in the books. I know they happen. Now I have witnessed one. And, dear boy, whatever it is, you'd better hang on to it. It's so much better than that which had you only an hour ago. Well, those coming hours were a great one. This reassurance that I was not lunatic helped. Supposing he had spoken to me other words and said, I'll give you a sedative, you'll feel better tomorrow. Perhaps this would not have altered the course of events. But you know, it was the humanity of the man that counted. So, the very next day, Abby brought up to me a book from which we drew another part of this synthesis. And that book was written by William James, called by some the father of modern psychology. And I read through this book titled Religious Experiences. Got one of those memory labs. Here there were varieties of religious experience. So, okay, here they were. The manifestations were many. Sometimes they were electric, sudden, overwhelming. At other times, they moved very slowly. They came under the auspices of religion, but also to an agnostic looking out a window, saying, the tree can respond to the laws of its nature and I cannot. Oh, higher power, oh God of the universe. And then, suddenly, or slowly, the transformation was set in. Now, as I read through the many descriptions, certain common denominators darted out. Nearly all of these transforming experiences laid on a basis of calamity, concerning a controlling situation in the life of the individual that on his resources or on any other resources could not be transcended. He could not get over, he could not get around, he could not get under. And when that got him at depth, he was wide open for what we agree with our friends of religion is God's grace. So, the problem of bringing other alcoholics to this experience was not the problem of bolstering up this ego. It was of deflating it. So, as a deflationary tool, one thought, well, Jung had handed it to Hazard. Ebbe had handed it to me, but most particularly had Silkworth. In other words, here was my God of science saying, for you, I can do nothing. So deflation at depth, today we bring on by talking about a compulsion that condemns us to drink, coupled with a physical condition that condemns us to lunacy and death. And when that is projected over the transference that we can so easily get with each other in this kinship of suffering, then there's the deflation. Then, when people turn to AA, even in dependence upon AA as God at first, this transformation sets in, the one we know so well. Well, you know the rest of the story. I fussed around New York with drunks. The experience had a certain paranoid component. I was prone to grandiosity. I think I announced during the first 6 months I was going to fix all the drunks in the world, which was a long departure from the experience. Ego came back. There wasn't a damn one got fixed until I arrived in Akron, and here was dear Dr. Bob. And so I said, I'm going to quit preaching. I'm going to quit demanding that these people have an experience like mine. Indeed, this was another cornerstone. If I am to stay sober myself, for I had been disconcerted by the failure of a business deal, I need this other alcoholic drunk or somewhere worse than he could ever need me. So we struck that mutuality. I got off of my pedestal. It clicked. Soon after there was a third. And in Akron, Bob with Sister Ignatia. Again in this benign synthesis. Medicine, religion, and our own experience launched the set of transformations running through 5,000 drunks at Akron in Bob's lifetime, and with Ignatia and co-workers in the area to another 10,000 up to the time of her death. Such is our debt to medicine. Such is our debt to the Christian teaching. Such, my friends, is our debt to the everlasting and eternal God.
Now, we have a distinguished AA clergyman in the audience. And pray for us, and then lead us together in the Lord's Prayer.
Almighty God, grant us the grace to always see the truth as you wish us to see it, and each day to come to you to learn your will, and give us the grace both to see it clearly and the ability and the strength to carry it out. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the power, and the power, and the glory, forever. Amen.